Today we're talking about what a single day on the American frontier would actually do to your body. Not the Hollywood version where everyone rides around with perfect teeth and a clean hat, but the real version, where life expectancy sat at 39 years, the #1 prescribed medicine was literally mercury, and the most advanced dental procedure available involved a blacksmith, a pair of pliers, and a bottle of whiskey. From roughly 1800 through 1890, the American frontier ranked among the most physically punishing environments human beings have ever walked into on purpose. Frederick Jackson Turner put it this way in 1893, quote, "The environment is at first too strong for the man. He must accept the conditions which it furnishes or perish." A lot of people ended up with option B, not because they chose it, but because the frontier had a way of making that choice for them. Millions of people signed up for this voluntarily, which is the wild part. The Homestead Act of 1862 promised 160 acres of free land to anyone willing to work it for 5 years. The Oregon Trail hit peak migration through the 1840s to 1860s, and the gold rush dragged hundreds of thousands to California, starting in 1849. By 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad connected the coasts, and by 1890, the U.S. Census Bureau officially declared the frontier closed. An entire continent had been crossed, settled, mined, and farmed in that span, at an extraordinary cost to the human bodies that did the crossing. So we're going to walk through 24 hours, sunrise to sunrise, and I want you to keep a running tally in your head of everything going wrong inside your body. But by the end of this video, you're going to feel very, very grateful for indoor plumbing, Advil, and the concept of a weekend. Waking up, 4:30. Your day begins before the sun comes up, because the sun doesn't have cows that need milking. A homesteader would have been sleeping on a straw mattress inside a sod house, which for those who don't know, meant a structure built from stacked slabs of dirt. Sod houses ran cheap, held warmth well, and came absolutely crawling with insects. Rain turned the roof into a mud faucet. Snakes dropped through from above, and that straw mattress doubled as a breeding ground for lice, fleas, and bedbugs. Lice ran so rampant on the frontier that people gave them a pet name, seam squirrels, which sounds adorable and is also completely disgusting. As bedbugs spread to the point where surveys from the early 1900s found nearly 1/3 of all urban residences infested. Rose Pender, visiting the American West in the 1880s, described the situation in 5 words. "Bugs abounded, so I got very little rest. Cowboys on a cattle drive didn't even get the luxury of a bug-infested mattress because they slept on bare ground in shifts while someone watched the herd. Rotating night guard duty, called night hawking, ran in 2 to 4 hour intervals, and Charlie Siringo described a stampede breaking out every stormy night in his 1885 memoir. That meant riding out in total darkness to turn a panicked herd, then trying to fall back asleep after the adrenaline wore off. 4 to 5 hours of broken rest per night, that's what the average cowboy on a drive managed. And new parents get more sleep than that. And new parents aren't also dodging 1,000 stampeding longhorns at 2 in the morning. Breakfast, 5 a.m. All right, you're up, you're itchy, you're running on almost no sleep. And now it's time for breakfast. Breakfast will be the same thing as lunch, the same thing as dinner, the same thing as yesterday, and the same thing as last week. Southern settlers called the core frontier diet the 3 M's: meal, meat, and molasses, which translated to cornmeal mush, salt pork, and molasses every single day without variation. Harriet Martineau complained that travelers could find, quote, little else than pork under all manner of disguises, while James Creasy wrote about choking down nothing but, quote, musty cornmeal dodgers for weeks at a stretch. Zero variety, miserable taste, and nutritional value that amounted to slow-motion self-destruction. Trail travelers and soldiers ate hardtack as their main food source, a flour and water biscuit about 3 by 3 inches and nearly half an inch thick, packing roughly 100 calories each. 9 to 10 pieces made up the daily army ration, which sounds generous until you realize that's barely 1,000 calories from crackers, and your body needs 4,000 to 6,000 today. John Billings summed it up. While hardtack was nutritious, yet a hungry man could eat his 10 in a short time and still be hungry. And this is the fun part. The hardtack came preloaded with weevils. Soldiers learned to eat in the dark so they wouldn't see what they were chewing, and the biscuits earned nicknames like molar breakers and tooth dullers, which tells you everything. Here's where the diet turns from miserable to lethal. That corn-heavy, monotonous food supply didn't just bore people, it destroyed them from the inside. Pellagra, triggered by niacin deficiency from too much corn and too little else, earned the name the disease of the 4 Ds: dermatitis, diarrhea, dementia, and death. More than 100,000 Americans died of pellagra by the 1930s, with over 3 million severely affected. Dr. Joseph Goldberger proved the connection in 1915 by feeding 11 volunteers at Rankin State Prison Farm the standard Southern poor diet of salt meat, molasses, and cornmeal. 6 of the 11 developed pellagra. And this is where it gets tragic. Native Americans had eaten corn for centuries without ever developing pellagra because they practiced nixtamalization, soaking corn in lime water, which unlocks the niacin so the human body can absorb it. European settlers watched indigenous peoples do this, decided they knew better, and then proceeded to die of a completely preventable nutritional deficiency for the next 100 years. History humbles you like that. Section 3. The Workday, 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. Your weevil crackers and corn mush are down, and now the real punishment begins. When I say work, I don't mean sitting at a desk and complaining about email notifications. Homesteaders ground through 12 to 16 hours a day during planting and harvest. Cowboys on cattle drives rode 15-hour shifts 7 days a week with 0 time off, and miners descended into darkness and heat for 10 to 12-hour stretches. Even children as young as 4 or 5 hauled water, milked cows, and churned butter. W.O. Atwater's pioneering 1888 nutrition research estimated that a man performing heavy labor burned well over 3,000 calories daily, and modern studies place manual farm labor at roughly 300 kilocalories per hour. A frontier farmer plowing, digging, splitting logs, and hauling water for 9 to 12 hours burned through 4,000 to 6,000 calories in a day, while cowboys spent 3,500 to 5,000, and miners ran through 3,500 to 4,500. Now think back to that breakfast. On a good day, total food intake might reach 1,700 to 3,000 calories, which means the body ran a massive deficit every single day, not as a diet plan, but as a slow-motion nutritional emergency. That deficit showed up in people's frames. 5'7" and 143 pounds. That's what the average Civil War soldier measured, a fair stand-in for frontier men generally. Or today's American male averages 5'9" and 195 pounds, and that 52-pound gap didn't come from some intentional fasting trend. It came from chronic undereating while performing the physical equivalent of an Ironman triathlon 6 days a week. The work itself killed at staggering rates. Agriculture carried a fatality rate 8.5 times greater than all other occupations combined, according to the National Safety Council. Mining topped even that, with fatality rates around 1,900, hitting approximately 300 per 100,000 miners per year, compared to about 9 today. Between 1880 and 1923, more than 70,000 miners died on the job, and that number only counts the ones who died immediately, not the uncounted thousands who deteriorated slowly from occupational disease. Stampedes turned cowboy work into something closer to a death lottery, what with riders galloping through pitch darkness to turn herds of thousands of panicking animals. George C. Duffield recorded it plainly in his trail diary. "There was one of our party drowned today, Mr. Carr, and several narrow escapes." River crossings killed more cowboys than gunfights ever did. $25 to $40 a month, roughly $1 a day. That's what this profession paid for work that could end your life on any given Tuesday. Every bone told the story. Frontier-era skeletons consistently show high rates of degenerative joint disease, spinal disc damage from heavy lifting, and stress markers at muscle attachment sites that map a lifetime of brutal physical strain. Victorian surgeons documented miners' spines curving permanently, their legs frequently bowing. A mining newspaper described these workers in 1863 as, quote, "You're strong and active men, but pallid in complexion and bent in form by reason of excessive labor, heat, and foul air. The water break that might kill you. At some point during your 16-hour work day, you need a drink of water, and this is where things shift from bad to potentially fatal. Frontier water sources ranged from disgusting to deadly. Wells and iron hand pumps didn't appear until the 1870s, which meant people drank from the same streams and rivers that hundreds of other emigrants used for bathing, laundry, and, let's be honest, as a toilet. Shallow wells sat feet from seeping cesspools, and an 1852 Oregon Trail diary warned, quote, "The great cause of diarrhea has been occasioned in most instances by drinking water from holes dug in the riverbank and along marshes. Cholera, typhoid, and dysentery traveled in that water, and cholera stood out as the most terrifying because of its speed. A person could feel perfectly healthy at breakfast, collapse in agony by noon, and die by nightfall, their skin wrinkling and turning blue within hours from catastrophic dehydration. Surviving the first 12 to 24 hours usually meant recovery, but the mortality rate among those infected ran at 20% or higher. Between 1849 and 1855, an estimated 6,000 to 12,000 overland emigrants died of cholera along the trails. St. Louis alone lost over 4,500 people in the 1849 epidemic, roughly 1/10 of the entire city. Native Americans suffered even worse, with half the Pawnees and 2/3 of the Southern Cheyennes wiped out between 1849 and 1852, leaving survivors who reportedly could not bury the hundreds of dead. But Martha Friel captured the horror in a letter from Ash Hollow, dated June 23, 1852. First of all, Francis Friel died June 4, 1852, and Maria Friel followed the 6th. Next came Polly Kastner, who died the 9th, and Lafayette Friel soon followed. He died the 10th. Elizabeth Friel, wife of Amos, died the 11th, and her baby died the 17th. You see, we have lost 7 persons in a few short days, all died of cholera. 7 members of one family in 2 weeks, all from the water. Spread evenly along the trail, the total death toll would place a grave every 50 yards from Missouri to Oregon City. Historians have called it this nation's longest graveyard. Getting sick, and the doctor who makes it worse. Let's say you've drunk the water, and now you don't feel right. Time to find a doctor. And here's where things somehow get worse, because the doctor might pose a bigger threat than the disease. Mid-1800s physicians operated with zero understanding of germs, bacteria, or viruses, basing their practice on the theory of the four humours from the 2nd century. Fewer than a quarter of practicing doctors held medical school degrees, and several states actually abolished physician licensing in the 1840s, which meant literally anyone could hang a shingle and call themselves a doctor. Your physician might have been a butcher last month, and honestly that might have been an upgrade, because at least butchers understood anatomy. Calomel, which is mercury chloride, ranked as the most commonly prescribed drug in the country, a violent purgative that doctors administered until the patient started drooling uncontrollably. That drooling wasn't the medicine working. It was mercury poisoning, and it softened gums until teeth fell out. Frontier verses captured the relationship well. Doctor comes with free goodwill, but ne'er forgets his calomel. My favorite detail in this entire video involves Dr. Benjamin Rush, who supplied Lewis and Clark with roughly 600 mercury pills, nicknamed Rush's Thunderbolts. Lewis and Clark dosed themselves so frequently that modern scientists have literally identified their campsites by testing mercury contamination levels in the soil. 200 years later, we can track exactly where Lewis and Clark stopped to use the bathroom because they excreted enough mercury to leave a permanent chemical signature in the ground. The earth itself still remembers their terrible medicine. Bloodletting served as the primary fever treatment, with a good doctor expected to cut deep enough that blood spurted into the air with every heartbeat. Surgery happened without anesthesia until the 1840s, since ether wasn't publicly demonstrated until 1846, and without any antiseptic technique until the 1860s and 1870s. Doctors moved between patients without washing hands, cleaning instruments, or changing clothes, and an estimated 80% of surgeries ended in infection before Lister's antiseptic principles gained traction. Patent medicines rushed in to fill the gap that actual medicine left wide open. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, marketed to parents of colicky babies, packed 65 milligrams of morphine per fluid ounce plus alcohol. 1 teaspoon delivered the equivalent of 20 drops of laudanum, enough to kill the average child. Annual sales topped 1.5 million bottles by 1868. The thousands of babies died, and the syrup earned the nickname the baby killer. The AMA didn't get around to denouncing it until 1911. Dentistry barely existed on the frontier. Only 3 dental schools operated in the entire United States at the end of the Civil War, and dentists didn't reach frontier communities until the 1870s in any real numbers. Extraction stood as virtually the only treatment, performed with pliers by whichever local professional happened to be available, whether doctor, blacksmith, or barber. Whiskey served as the only anesthesia. Most frontier citizens lost all their teeth by age 50. Doc Holliday, the famous gunfighter who started out as a trained dentist, relocated to Dodge City after his tuberculosis diagnosis, hoping the dry western air would help his lungs. It didn't, but at least he could pull your tooth before he died. One more dentistry story, because this one's too good to leave out. Clay Allison, the outlaw, visited a dentist in Cheyenne, Wyoming, who drilled the wrong tooth. After getting the correct tooth fixed somewhere else, Allison returned to the original dentist's office and extracted one of the dentist's teeth with a pair of pliers. That remains the most frontier response to a malpractice complaint anyone has ever recorded. After noon, the environment tries to end you. At this point, your body runs on inadequate calories, possibly fights a waterborne disease, and your remaining teeth cling to your gums through hope and mercury residue. The day isn't over, though, and the environment has a few things left to throw at you. Without sunscreen, which wouldn't exist until the 1930s, settlers spent 10 to 14 hours daily under direct sun. Oregon Trail emigrants' lips blistered and split in the dry air, and their only remedy involved rubbing axle grease on them. Wheel lubricant, on your face, because that counted as the best option available. Dust shredded lungs over time. Trail dust piled 2 to 3 inches deep and hung in the air as fine as flour, and for miners the damage turned catastrophic. A study of 720 lead and zinc miners in Joplin, Missouri between 1913 and 1915 found that 46% had developed silicosis, with another 14% showing silicosis complicated by tuberculosis. Vermont's granite industry affected 93% of its workers, and here's the number that should stop you cold. In 1843, half of Sheffield's cutlery grinders died before reaching age 30 from lung disease. 30 years old, and they were already in the ground. Rattlesnake bites killed at an estimated 25% mortality rate in the 1800s, compared to less than 0.1% today, with modern antivenom, which didn't become available until 1954. Every frontier treatment for snake bite, tourniquets, cutting and sucking the wound, cauterizing with a branding iron, turned out to be either useless or actively harmful. Getting bitten by a rattlesnake meant your best outcome depended on the snake having delivered a dry bite, and your worst outcome depended on someone trying to help. Grizzly bears posed threats that popular memory tends to underplay, and one story captures the frontier body's capacity for punishment better than any statistic. On August 23, 1823, a frontiersman named Hugh Glass took a mauling from a mother grizzly near the Grand River in present-day South Dakota. A broken leg, a punctured throat, and deep lacerations that exposed his ribs. That's what he survived. His companions assumed he'd died and abandoned him after taking his weapons, and Glass crawled and stumbled over 200 miles to Fort Kiowa across 2 months, surviving on insects, snakes, and scavenged meat. 200 miles on a broken leg with exposed ribs because the alternative was lying there and dying, and apparently Hugh Glass wasn't built for that. Cold killed even faster. January 12, 1888, a date known as the School Children's Blizzard, struck the Great Plains after an unseasonably warm morning. One weather station recorded a drop from 44 degrees Fahrenheit to negative 42, or nearly 100 degrees of temperature change in hours. Around 235 people died. Teacher Lois Royce of Plainview, Nebraska, tried to lead 3 students to her boarding house less than 90 yards away, and all 3 children froze to death, while Royce lost both feet to frostbite. 19-year-old teacher Etta Shattuck turned up alive in a haystack 78 hours after the storm, but both legs required amputation. 90 yards, that's all it took for the frontier to end you. Evening, hygiene, whiskey, and the mind. The workday finally winds down, and what passes for evening self-care on the American frontier deserves its own special attention. Bathing demanded enormous effort in an era before the 1870s, when water had to be hauled from streams by hand. Many homesteaders climbed into the horse trough to wash up, and families who did manage a proper tub sent men through first, then women, then children, all using the same water. Some people held a genuine belief that too much cleanliness opened pores to disease. Rose Pender described a bath as a luxury she hadn't enjoyed for 10 straight days. Stagecoach stations kept a community toothbrush made from animal bristle, shared by anyone who felt like using it. Let that image settle in for a moment. A communal toothbrush at a roadside station. Toilet paper didn't show up until the late 1800s, which meant people relied on old newspaper, Sears and Roebuck catalogues, corn cobs, or whatever leaves happened to grow nearby. An anonymous settler captured the reality perfectly in the St. Joseph Gazette. He must learn to eat with his unwashed fingers, drink out of the same vessel as his mules, or sleep on the ground when it rains, share his blanket with vermin, and have patience with mosquitoes. It is hardship without glory. That last line matters. Hardship without glory, and nobody recording it for an audience. Alcohol served as the frontier's all-purpose solution for stress relief and pain management, and the consumption numbers reflect just how heavily people leaned on it. 7.1 gallons of pure ethanol per capita per year. That's what the United States consumed at its peak in 1830, nearly 3 times today's rate of about 2.5 gallons. Pure ethanol, not beer, not wine, straight ethanol. Whiskey sold for 25 cents a gallon by the 1820s, which made it cheaper than beer, wine, coffee, tea, or milk. And when the healthiest drink costs more than rot gut, people drank the rot gut. Dodge City reportedly kept 1 saloon for every 50 residents, while Bodie, California, population around 10,000, packed in 65 saloons and recorded 29 murders between 1877 and 1883, the highest murder rate of any American city at the time. The whiskey itself often contained strychnine, tobacco, molasses, and genuinely snakeheads, earning the nickname tarantula juice because that's what it felt like going down. Isolation inflicted its own physical damage, manifesting as a phenomenon called prairie madness. Journalist Eugene Virgil Smalley wrote in The Atlantic in 1893, "An alarming amount of insanity occurs in the new prairie states among farmers and their wives. Homesteads sat at least half a mile apart, often much farther, with towns typically 10 to 20 miles distant. Women frequently endured weeks alone while husbands traveled for supplies or work, and the Nebraska Asylum for the Insane tracked the toll clearly, with admissions jumping from 87 in 1871 to 545 in 1885 as territorial settlement accelerated. Danish settler Rasmus Nielsen called Nebraska, quote, a Siberia rather than the Garden of Eden he'd been promised. Not one frontier, who suffered and how. Before we reach the end of these 24 hours, one thing needs to be clear. The frontier wasn't a single experience. Different people endured it in dramatically different ways, and some had it far worse than others. An estimated 25% of all trail cowboys, at least 5,000 individuals, were black, including figures like Nat Love, known as Deadwood Dick, Bows-Eye Card, and Bill Pickett. Pay ran relatively equal, but black cowboys consistently drew the most dangerous assignments, breaking wild horses and leading cattle across deep rivers first. The Buffalo Soldiers of the 9th and 10th Cavalry, 24th and 25th Infantry, fought in nearly 200 engagements over 30 years and earned 14 to 18 Medals of Honor, all while receiving aged horses and deteriorating equipment. Chinese laborers made up over 90% of the Central Pacific Railroad's workforce, between 10,000 and 15,000 workers earning $26 per month, which ran 30 to 50% less than white workers received. That money also had to cover their own food, lodging, and tools. Companies lowered these men in baskets to plant explosives on cliff faces, sent them boring through solid granite at Summit Tunnel, and kept them working through brutal winters and desert heat above 120 degrees. An estimated 1,000 or more died during construction, though exact numbers remain unknown because nobody bothered keeping careful records. In June 1867, 3,000 Chinese workers organized what became the largest labor strike in U.S. history to that point, and the company ended it after 8 days by simply cutting off all food supplies. Women carried physiological burdens that compounded everything else. American women in 1800 gave birth an average of 7 to 8 times, and maternal mortality on the frontier ran 3 times higher than in New England. A woman who bore 5 to 8 children faced a lifetime risk of dying in childbirth as high as 1 in 8, and many delivered without a doctor or midwife present. The 1850 census recorded infant mortality at 28%, meaning more than 1 in 4 babies didn't survive. That homesteaders failed at a rate of 60%. Roughly 2 million claims went in under the Homestead Act, and only about 700 to 83,000 ever reached completion. That 160-acre allotment worked fine for farming in the humid east, but it proved simply inadequate for the arid plains. These weren't lazy people giving up. The land itself made the math impossible. Where you settled also shaped which specific nightmare you faced. Great Plains homesteaders built sod houses, endured grasshopper plagues that blanketed the ground 6 to 12 inches deep, and weathered blizzards that sealed families indoors for days. Arizona earned the nickname the Siberia of the Frontier Army, with Fort Mojave losing an average of 2 soldiers per week to dysentery. Rocky Mountain mining camps saw populations balloon overnight, like Creede, Colorado, which jumped from 600 to over 10,000 in 2 years, before collapsing and leaving behind broken communities. Fort Crawford, Wisconsin reported 154 of 199 soldiers infected with malaria in 1830, and the only effective treatment, quinine, cost $6 to $8 per ounce, so expensive that one Indiana doctor sold an entire herd of cattle at $7.50 per head just to afford it. As we approach the final hours of this 24-hour span, it's time to zoom out and look at the full picture, because the numbers are where the frontier really bears its teeth, or more accurately, where it takes them. 90% of all pioneer deaths came from disease, not violence, not accidents, not conflict with Native Americans. Disease. Every Western movie ever made has focused on the other 10%, while the real killer, the one that struck down 9 out of every 10 people who died on the trail, stayed invisible, living in the water, the air, the food, and the dirt. Frontier Army records lay it out in black and white. From 1860 to 1886, a total of 1,993 soldiers fell killed or wounded in the Indian Wars, and in the single year of 1886 alone, 1,217 soldiers died of cholera. Civil War records showed the same pattern across 700,000 soldier deaths, with over 400,000 coming from disease, a consistent 2-to-1 ratio of disease deaths to combat deaths that held across the entire frontier era. At every frontier post, the hospital took more soldiers than the enemy ever did. Tuberculosis alone killed an estimated 1 in 7 Americans, accounting for approximately 1 in 4 deaths each year through the 1800s. Was around 450 Americans died of TB every single day at the turn of the century. Roughly 80% of those who developed active tuberculosis never recovered, instead wasting away over months or years. People called it consumption, because that's precisely what it did. It consumed you, turning skin pale, filling lungs with blood, and reducing a living person to a ghost of themselves over agonizing stretches of time. Scurvy claimed an estimated 10,000 gold rush miners. Sutter's Fort recorded 18 to 20 deaths per day for 5 months straight, starting in January 1850, and one witness described victims who, quote, rotted to death by inches. Another described a sick man, quote, drawn up into a kind of ball, and could have been rolled over and over like a bale of carpet. Scurvy turns the body against itself, breaking down connective tissue, to reopening old wounds and swelling gums until teeth drop out, and the cure amounted to eating a lemon or any fresh fruit or vegetable. On the frontier, fresh produce sat weeks or months away from the nearest source. 1 in 5 gold rush miners died within 5 months of arriving in the camps. Nearly 1 in 10 Oregon Trail emigrants never completed the journey, and up to 65,000 deaths occurred along the overland trails over 25 years. Life expectancy at birth in 1850 landed at 39.4 years. Child mortality skews that number, and a white male who reached age 5 could expect to live to roughly 50. 50 still marked the finish line for a lot of people, and those 50 years carried the full weight of everything we've covered, not the comfortable decades we picture today. So here's the tally on your 24 hours at the American frontier. You woke up covered in lice on a bug-infested straw mattress after 4 to 5 hours of broken sleep. Breakfast consisted of corn mush and salt pork that slowly built toward pellagra. 12 to 16 hours of manual labor followed, burning thousands more calories than you consumed, because math doesn't care about the American dream. Water came from a source that hundreds of other people and animals had been using as a combined bath, laundry station, and latrine. Dust thick enough to destroy your lungs within years filled every breath. A real statistical chance of contracting cholera, dysentery, or typhoid hung over the entire day, diseases for which no effective treatment existed. And the treatments that did exist, mercury pills, bloodletting, opiate syrups, often killed faster than the diseases they claimed to cure. DeLewis and Clark's campsites can still be identified today by the mercury that leached into the soil from their medicine. 2 centuries later, the ground itself still remembers how bad 19th century healthcare performed. What strikes hardest about the frontier isn't the hardship, though. It's the gap between what people endured and what they understood. Germ theory didn't take hold until the 1860s to 1880s, and the cholera bacterium wasn't identified until 1883, 3 full decades after cholera had already killed tens of thousands on the overland trails. Antiseptic surgery didn't exist before 1867, and Semmelweis proved that hand-washing prevented infection back in 1847, only to have his own colleagues dismiss him as crazy. The Pure Food and Drug Act didn't pass until 1906, was after generations of Americans had consumed morphine baby syrup and mercury pills as standard medicine. That timeline deserves a second look. Pasteur published his germ theory findings between 1857 and 1861, and Koch identified the cholera bacterium in 1883, all of which came after peak frontier migration had already passed. Every person who walked the Oregon Trail, panned for gold in California, and built a sod house on the Nebraska prairie did so in a world where nobody could name the things that kept killing them. The frontier didn't just test the body, it broke the body in ways that modern medicine arrived too late to prevent, and that modern archaeology continues cataloguing in the bones left behind. Next time you complain about your commute, your lukewarm coffee, or slow Wi-Fi, remember that 170 years ago, the leading cause of death came from drinking water. The dentist operated as a blacksmith, and the best-selling children's medicine contained morphine. We've come a long way, mostly because we had to.